Welcome back to The Breakaway with David and Fabian. We have one of our favorite guests on today, Mr. Richard Stern, who is the director of the federal budget here at the beautiful Heritage Foundation, where we are filming out of. Thank you so much for being back.
Pleasure to be back.
We're literally just half a mile away from where the 45th will become the 47th. So what a better way to start things off than to talk about, I guess, the economy, federal budget, and all that stuff, because it was the most important thing during the election. So let's start off with something that you put out recently on X. And you asked, how much are you willing to raise taxes or add to the national debt to buy Greenland? Or should we not acquire it at all or take it by force or economic sanctions only? And it was kind of split 31% for up to $100 billion. That was one of the options. And then the other option that got 31% was that take it by force or tariffs. What's going on with Greenland? Is this actually possible? Is it good for America to acquire it? We want to know.
No, it's a great question. So I think, first of all, one of the things that shows to me is the kind of renewed optimism in America and what America stands for that Trump, now 45 and 47, is going to bring back to the country. So, part of why I did that poll is I wanted to know what people were thinking. And obviously, my audience, a lot of the accounts that retweet me are all part of the MAGA base. And so I wanted to get a sense from them. And, so as you talked about, I put in a low option for spending and a high option, and then take it by force. And then I also put in, or should we not get it? Only about a quarter think we shouldn't try to take it. So, again, part of this is Greenland is the largest island on the planet. It is right between us and Russia geographically. If you whip up Google Maps and you flip up to the North Pole, you'll see exactly why it's strategic. If you look at a two-dimensional map, that isn't clear at all. But if you look on Google Maps, you'll see it right there. All of the missile trajectories of the missiles they've got and the missiles we've got would go over Greenland. We already have an Air Force base there. We already have a space base there. But also, and I should mention is that, part of why we have a space base there is, you think of going to orbit. I'm from Florida. We take off from Cape Canaveral. That's easy for getting into orbits around the equator. Yes. But what you can do from Greenland is very easily get into polar orbits. Now, you might say, well, then Santa Claus, who needs a polar orbit, right? If you're in a polar orbit, the Earth is spinning like this under you. In a polar orbit, you will eventually fly over every square inch of land and sea on the planet Earth. So they're very rare, very strategically important orbits. It takes a lot of energy to go from something near the equator to a polar orbit. It takes nothing to go from something from Greenland into that kind of orbit. But there's also perhaps trillions of dollars worth of minerals, coal, oil, rare earth minerals, the kind that China at the moment has a global monopoly on. So these are all the reasons why this has come up in the conversation. And frankly, the U.S. has been talking about buying Greenland since 1868, which is the first time the Commerce Department did a report on buying Greenland.
And I definitely agree, because right now, the only place that we can launch polar orbits is out of Vandenberg Air Force Base out in California, which I've been to a few launches. It's incredible. But I agree, we do need some other area to launch polar orbit missions. And I did want to ask, just kind of piggybacking on the Greenland thing, Canada. Now Canada's also being thrown into the fray. Is that realistically possible? And from an economic standpoint, what would it look like integrating their economy with ours? Because that just seems like a massive problem or issue.
So I'm going to be honest. For Greenland, small population, lots of strategic value, lots of mineral value. They would like independence. That, I think, makes a lot more sense. Here's the concern with Canada. I think, obviously, if you talk to Canadians, they feel Canadian. They don't feel American. But the other side of that is, to be perfectly honest, integrating the two economies would be a little bit like integrating East and West Germany. Not that they didn't do it, but you're talking about a country. So Canada, on average, if it became one state, and obviously it wouldn't be one state if it joined, but if it was, would be the poorest, least economically developed state in the United States. And that speaks to what democratic socialism does to a country. They have been buried under regulations, massive government spending, a poorly run currency, all of these things that we decry the left for. The reasons why California is on fire right now, those have been going on in Canada since the founding of the country. Right. So it would be hard to integrate, let alone culturally and a lot of the values that we take, sometimes unfortunately for granted in the Bill of Rights that they don't have. But I'll say this, though. All of this, I think, has helped push Trudeau out of the government. It has helped push the Conservatives to the forefront. The guy that's leading the Conservative Party there, I think, is a superb intellect. He believes in small government, free market principles. So I think there's an integration to be had there but it's in building a tighter alliance, a stronger integrated sense of economies to really build them up as an ally that follows our kind of principles and will follow those good economic principles that'll bring prosperity to their people as well as ours.
What do you think about this whole idea now that we can, take Greenland, acquire Greenland, perhaps something with Canada? Is this a wrong step to take by the incoming administration, or is this economically, militarily, strategical, important for the United States?
Well, I certainly don't think we should actually take Greenland by force. However, I think the memes are fun.
Yeah.
There's another politics that's going on here, and I think a lot of people, some people are energized by the idea of taking either by force, which bugs me a little bit, of course, right? But at the same time, though, it is only 31% of my poll, for example, and that's of the MAGA base that are saying that. I think what's going on here is, with Canada, you're talking about, I think, frankly, an evil guy who was running the country, right? And I'm glad Trudeau is gone. I mean, keep in mind, this is a man who put to shame any of the liberals in this country, who locked people up during COVID, who arrested people for literally stepping outside to take a breath of fresh air. I mean, truly evil guy. So I think what you were looking at from Trump was forceful politics to make it abundantly clear that what he was doing was immoral, was evil. And it helped to build pressure. It helped to build legitimacy for the elements of Canada that wanted to get him out. I don't think Trump ever was intending to do anything forceful to Canada. He wanted to empower the good guys, right? With Greenland, I think one of the interesting points on this is for decades at this point, lots of different groups, reputable groups, have polled the population there, and you routinely get 2/3 plus of the Greenlandic population who want independence from Denmark. So whether Denmark has a right or not to the land and completely separate from the U.S. using force, I believe in self-governance. We all do. So if there's a population of people who truly want to be separate and independent, that should matter. And so again, I think what you're seeing here is not really a politics about the U.S. using force or going to war with an ally. I think what you're seeing here is a full-throated defense of a population's right to self-governance, as Thomas Jefferson put in the Declaration of Independence.
I do want to ask you about South America, or rather Central America. I'm starting to see for myself another East versus West kind of Cold War shift happening with the U.S. trying to acquire, Greenland, Canada, China integrating its claws into South America, Central America, Africa. I have family in El Salvador, and they're telling me how so many new things are being paid for by China, yet the American politicians are still, giving praise to the president there for doing such a good job. And I'm thinking, why would they be doing that if they understand that it's China coming in? What's going on there?
So I think one of the tragic things that's happened in Latin America literally for 200 plus years is that you have weak countries, and I don't just mean that the governments are weak, but I mean that there's not the kind of sense of cultural unity, manifest destiny that the U.S. had. And so these countries have not banded together at times. They've fallen prey to European and now Asian imperial forces. One of the few success stories actually was Mexico pushing out an effort by the French to invade and take over Mexico, something most people don't even remember happened. So, I think this is another step in the long run of tragedies of large imperial powers trying to come in and carve up Latin America, pit people against each other, pit the elites versus the working class and the working poor in a lot of these countries. I'm sure your family's seen. So I think that's what's going on here again, right? And to be honest, we saw this with Dole Pineapple and American companies that went in and took out legitimate governments. Then the CIA took it over from the American private sector. We've had other European powers. You've now got China coming in. So I think what you're seeing is a retread of that, where you've got U.S. politicians, you've got Chinese politicians trying to go in, take control of these countries. I think El Salvador has shown a way out of that a little bit, a way towards independence. Bitcoin is one of those ways that they're doing that. So, for my chips on the table, I think what we should try to do as the U.S. here is not try to gain a foothold. I think what we should try to do is empower the people in these countries. And if we can do that successfully, then we can build up populations there that are as forcefully opposed to imperial takeovers as the U.S. population was in the late 1700s. And if we can do that, then these countries won't become pawns of their own elites being controlled by the Chinese elites. They will become truly independent, fiercely independent countries. And I think that's the better way to win friends and allies there. And I think that's a better long-term future, not just for Latin America, and not just for us, but for the world. And we need to break that chain of imperialism.
What are some of the, I guess, dangerous impacts that or that we can have in the United States from China having so much influence in Latin America and Africa, especially after so many years, decades now of us spending so much money on trying to build up Africa by changing regimes, making them force democracy upon them. But China is doing it a little bit different, where they're actually prompting their infrastructure, the ability to actually trade with China. What danger does that have to the United States economically wise, with China having so much influence in Africa and Latin America?
I'm a deep believer that everything ultimately is downstream of culture. And I think you see that in global politics as well. And so the United States, of course, became this shining light, this city on a hill of freedom, of small government, of a belief in individual people's ability to provide for themselves and their communities. And we managed to take over most of the world, not forcefully, but with the power of our message, with the righteousness of it. Frankly, very much the way that Christianity did, starting from literally a dozen apostles and converting over the entire Western world, not by force, but with truth. And that's what the U.S. did. Here's, I think, the dangerous thing, of course. If a different country can do that with a different ideology, and in this case with China, an ideology of oppression, that humans are othered, that there are elites to rule and that there are people below to be ruled, that is a dangerous break from that tradition of believing in people, empowering people. If China can culturally take over the world, we might be in for centuries of another dark age around the globe. Now, you might ask yourself, well, if our system is true, we're at that kind of Christian Western system of belief in the agency of human beings, believing in divine law to govern our affairs, then how can China box us out? And I tell you this, I think the sad truth is, and you just brought it up, the Chinese are acting more American than we are. Yep. Our involvement in these countries is often to send the CIA to murder legitimate governments and to strip away property rights of people who are there and hand it through government conveyance to some company that otherwise would have been a good private market operating company that is now just a shill, a contractor of our government or some other government. China has been going in, building infrastructure, has been making it easy for them to trade. So it's not that the Chinese are bringing free markets, but they are, in an odd way, doing things more the way you would expect America to do outside of our borders, and we're not. And so I think the danger of that, of course, is that most people around the world view America as just another imperialist country. They don't view us for the values that we would like America to espouse. And I think that's part of that danger.
And just to build up on that, it seems like Fabian was saying, we're in a Cold War essentially with China and a trade war with them. There's not a hot war, warm war, however way you want to call it, right?
Lukewarm, yeah.
Lukewarm, right? And it may never be, because China does depend on the United States in terms of the demand. But can they eventually replace the demand that they have from the United States by building up Latin America, South America, and Africa, and essentially replacing us with the demand that they'll eventually have from them by building the infrastructure there?
Absolutely. And Europe as well, by the way. I mean, a lot of European countries are doing exactly the same thing. In fact, what you're kind of seeing globally is most of the world moving away from us, moving towards the Chinese pole. Frankly, you see the EU trying to form their own pole. And I think part of the danger, again, about this is, China's economy at the moment is stalled under the weight of socialism, of repressive government. Whether China satisfies that and figures out how to really get back to something more like a free market and success remains to be seen. But India is trying the same experiment. The EU, beholden to the woke left, to the climate change, Illuminati, basically, right? You've got all these groups around the world who are trying to take the economic success of free markets and pair it with an oppressive government. So they'll never be as productive or as good, but they're hoping that they can take the products of freedom without having to accept the process of freedom. And the danger is, if any of them can do that enough to dislodge us, then again, I think you step down that road towards a dark age. I'm less concerned, kind of specifically, with China's takeover. I'm more concerned with that kind of oppressive, anti-Western, anti-freedom ideology taking over, and that is absolutely what's going on at the moment.
If I was this tyrannical leader of a authoritarian South American, Central African country, I would more want the Chinese here because they wouldn't want to try to change my form of democracy. They'd probably like that I'm a strong man because they have stability in that region for 30, 40 years. I did want to talk about crypto a bit because you mentioned Bitcoin in El Salvador. And I know that something like 80% of all crypto transactions are involving a stable coin. Thoughts on stable coins, and specifically ones that are tied to something other than the value of the dollar, let's say like silver or something, which has a much better staying power.
So certainly, the more the currency is based on something that is outside of a government's control, something that's rare, the way silver and gold are. And silver and gold, of course, are not rare because we've all decided God made them rare, right? They're unique chemical elements, they're noble metals. So, the more that you have a currency that's based on something literally that nature forces to be scarce, is outside of government control, the more reliable it's going to be of store value over time, right? If we look through hundreds of years of price data when we had gold and silver currencies, you see a remarkable flatness in prices over centuries. These are countries that obviously, didn't have radios or cell phones. Their form of communication was, a pen and a quill and a piece of paper and a guy on horseback, and prices were the same and flat everywhere.
Wow.
That's the power of that. But, what I would say also is there's a new kind of fascinating thing with this, which is that, hundreds of years ago, the only things you had like that were silver and gold. Now with cryptos, you could have an infinite number of things like this that are based on any number of baskets of commodities or not, or just the code in the cryptos. Having that kind of diversity of the market itself gives you a stability, gives you a reliability, and gives you a power to get outside of government coercion.
To go from being stable, let's also talk about efficiency. With Trump winning the election, he announced that there will be the Department of Government Efficiency as well. And obviously that's with Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. And it's been very controversial, but at the same time, it's received bipartisan support. I've seen Democrats come out and say that this is good.
Bernie Sanders?
Right? So it's crazy stuff like that. But I think regardless what political ideology you're part of, you want the government to be actually efficient for you. What are we looking at when we're talking about government efficiency? Where do you even start cutting? What do you cut? Is there anything to cut even?
Well, I think one of the problems, of course, is when you get a liberal, a conservative in the room, and they both say there's government waste, they're not talking about the same thing. That's part of the problem. Okay. But yeah, what I'd say is for sure, there are, trillions of dollars of government spending that are clearly outside of the constitutional bounds. So even if you think that the government shouldn't just stick to the Constitution, of course, I'm a constitutionalist, but if you do, there's trillions of dollars that already government shouldn't be doing, should be given back to people. But even if you believe in an expansionist view of the government's own known, and that's the key word here, their known amount of money that they just lose annually is around $400 billion a year. And then if you go under the hood, you realize that is the tip of the iceberg. And that's money they know they lose. That's not inefficiency. It's not paying for workers who never show up, who never do their job. The federal government sits on more empty office space than there are in most countries on the planet, period. So, there's things like that. But I'll tell you one of I think the biggest things that DOGE can do, and I'm excited about, for literally decades, there have been attempts in Congress to really quantify all of this. I'm using very large, more office buildings and you could fit on the moon and whatever. The truth is, we don't know how much. We know a very small amount of the waste. We have hints and rumors about this and that. And you might say, well, how can we not know? That is how opaque the federal bureaucracy is. That is how large the bureaucracy is. That is how unaccountable it is. That is how disorganized and disconnected the entire accounting structure is. The Department of Defense, right? So the entity that we trust to be able to track an incoming missile and respond to it in 5 minutes, to name a billion other things that are like that, cannot pass an audit. So, when you go down the line, right, there's clearly an enormous amount of waste, of loss, of fraud, of abuse. And keep in mind, every single dollar the government takes and spends is a dollar stolen from hardworking Americans. Whether it's taxes you file or it's the inflation taxes you pay at the pump or at the grocery store cash register.
I'd like to kind of paint a picture and go to a rosy world where I've heard that Elon and Vivek want to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget, which is an astronomical number. If that money was actually freed up, what could happen to the country with having so much more money available.
What I will say, as astronomical as if you look at Heritage and the Republican Study Committee's proposed budgets over the years, we get to that level of cuts. We don't do it overnight, but you make tweaks now, you get rid of things now, you start, and within a 10-year period, you can get to that kind of cut over the baseline. But if you freed that money up, that is resources that would go back to the private sector to build more for the future. So, and whether that, here's a perfect example. Mortgage rates right now are over 7%. And so most Americans could not afford to buy a home right now. That money that would be in money markets that they could borrow that would keep mortgage rates at 3% is instead stolen by the government. So if you free that money up, mortgage rates plummet. Rates on small business loans plummet. Car loans plummet. You could afford to buy a car, afford to get a house. Small businesses could afford to get money to expand operations, to hire people, and that ripples throughout the economy. So really, when the government's taking that money and running those deficits, it's strangling opportunity.
How much of it is the federal government spending on things that are just not necessary for the United States, maybe weird experiments here and there, versus how much it is just plain missing, just money allocated to a certain department? They didn't allocate it towards any experiments. It's just gone. $500 billion is just gone. Nobody can find it, like with the Department of Defense, for example.
My guess, based on what we've seen, is it's mostly bad programs, but with a healthy margin of just loss and waste on top of it. So I think you can kind of, any government program, you probably put a 20% markup. So you think if you go to a restaurant, you leave a tip. Think of that as every time you have food for a federal program, there's a tip on top, but the tip is lost, right? But yeah, I mean, most of what the federal government spends money on is extra constitutional. It's putting the thumb on the scale in one way or the other. I think perfect example on this is green energy. We've talked about this, of course, before. You know, when Biden was president, Democrats were in charge of Congress. They passed trillions of dollars of tax credits going to wind farms that won't work, to solar panels that are inefficient. All of this steals money from productive enterprises and uses it to jack up energy prices. It's not just that government is less efficient or inefficient or wastes money. It's that government actively takes resources out of where they would be positive for producing goods and services and puts them into places where they actually manage to produce fewer goods and services. That's the problem here.
I wanted to talk about the TikTok ban that's come into effect on the 19th. We were just speaking with someone who was inside of the Supreme Court when the oral arguments were happening. What do you think? Number one, maybe the first part is, does it have any kind of economic impact with all that money going to people being paid out? And secondly, what do you think happens with this? Do you think that there is an American buyer and then something happens after the administration to fix things? Or
So I think one of the questions in there, right, is there's obviously enough economic value that you could get a buyer. I think there's no question that there'd be enough people that could get the investment dollars together that it would be lucrative enough. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why has that not happened? And I think that does speak to, unfortunately, the massive Chinese government involvement with TikTok. So as with any new regulation, as with confronting any uncomfortable economic situation, there's economic disruption. And that is true whether you're talking about, frankly, ending slavery or banning organized crime in the 20s, dealing with prohibition. We've had hundreds of years of history of dealing with, any degree of gradation of uncomfortable economic arrangement. So not comparing TikTok to slavery, though the Uyghurs would probably.
Yeah, exactly.
But, any time that you've got some kind of criminal activity going on, you have some nefarious action, a foreign government that's using something in a reckless and hostile fashion, or even private entities that are doing things that are illicit, that are ethically questionable or bad, there's always going to be some economic disruption. And I think part of what you've seen here is the Chinese government, along with everything else we've been talking about, turned TikTok very much into probably the most successful spying apparatus of any centralized state in human history. So that's the unfortunate part about it. Whether we can actually wrest control of that and get a buyer and get control of the data or not, I think remains to be seen. But I think it shows you the power of the Chinese clutches over this, that hasn't happened so far.
Just one more question real quick. So we got a couple minutes. There was a huge debate on X a couple of weeks ago over the holidays about legal immigration, not illegal, and specifically the H-1B visa programs. Now, I looked it up, and it's only 85,000 of these issued a year. They're only here for 6 years, and they put so much into our economy while not actually taking benefit of certain services like Medicaid and whatnot. They also spend a lot on our economy. Yeah. I guess, your position when it comes down to this specific program?
Sure. So I think one of the big problems that a lot of people have kind of ignored in the details is we call it a high-skilled worker program, but it's got a salary floor of 60 grand. And then the other problem is there are, at this point, about 10 times as many applications as there are seats awarded out. And then you might ask yourself, well, how do we whittle down to a 10% acceptance rate? Do we go by merit? Do we go by how much they're going to be paid, what they contribute? No, we have a lottery. So you have great minds, great people that would do exactly what you're talking about, that would contribute, who lose the lottery to somebody who's going to contribute almost nothing. And actually, what you find is that there's massive statistical biases between the applicant population and the people that get the lottery. And really what that shows you is there's a bunch of companies who've bought regulators, who know how the system works, who are running fake applications and applications for real people, but that they would never intend on hiring to game the lottery system. So the actual visa's broken the way. The Trump admin, though, had a rule that didn't get finalized, unfortunately, back in 2020, that would rank order by salary. So basically, you could have a million applications for the 85,000 slots, and you'd rank order from highest salary to lowest, and go down until you got the 85,000. Now, for anybody listening saying, well, that seems rather materialistic, here's what I would say, though, right? If this is somebody who is going to really provide some niche, unique service, not that they're coming here to take a job, but as you said, they're coming to contribute, to provide prosperity, to produce goods and services that help everybody, a doctor, an engineer, etc. Then if they're worth it and the company here really thinks that they'll have the value, they'll put the money up to pay them enough to get them at the top of the queue. It's a non-materialistic use of money to allow the American private sector to find the best, the brightest, the most talented, those with the most to contribute, and bring them over here. So I think that reform absolutely needs to be done. But on the broader question, I absolutely agree with you. We want the best and brightest here. I'll say this. America went from being a very, very sparsely populated backwater to the third most populous country on the planet, the largest, most powerful, most influential country in human history, precisely because we brought in people who were entrepreneurial, who had gumption, who wanted to contribute. We don't want those people stuck in oppressive regimes. God forbid, we don't want those people building bombs for the Chinese government. We want them here, and we want them contributing and inventing a future that's more prosperous for everyone, especially Americans.
Yeah, I had a buddy who saw my post on Instagram and messaged me back. He has a large company, and he says, LOL, dude, I've been using H-1B visas for 10 years to get cheap labor. And that really, really stuck with me.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Richard Stern, for
Thank
being
you,
with
Richard.
us. It's always a pleasure, and we hope to have you back on soon.
Likewise, and thank you so much.